The sun was setting over the city, casting long golden rays through the towering buildings of downtown. The sidewalks were filled with the usual evening rush, businessmen hurrying home, couples strolling hand in hand, and street vendors calling out their last offers of the day. Amidst the bustling crowd, a small figure moved swiftly, weaving between pedestrians with practiced ease. Calvin Morse, a 12-year-old boy with messy brown hair and a face far too serious for his age, knew these streets better than most. He had lived on them for as long as he could remember. Dressed in a tattered hoodie, his jeans barely holding together at the seams, and shoes so worn that his toes peeked through, Calvin blended into the background, just another forgotten soul in a city that moved too fast to notice him. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten since the day before. Hunger had become a constant companion, one he had learned to ignore, but today it gnawed at him more fiercely than usual. He rummaged through a trash can near a bakery, hoping to find anything edible. His fingers closed around a half-eaten sandwich, and he pulled it out quickly, brushing off a few crumbs. "Hey, kid! Get out of there!" Calvin flinched at the angry voice. A shopkeeper stood at the doorway, a broom in hand, his face twisted in disgust. "Sorry, sir. I don't care what you were just doing. Get lost." Calvin didn't wait for another warning. He knew better than to argue. Heart pounding, he took off down the street, his small frame disappearing into the moving crowd. He slowed his pace after a few blocks, catching his breath. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to shake off the humiliation more than the dirt. Looking around, his sharp blue eyes scanned for his next chance at a meal. That's when he noticed the man. Tall, sharply dressed, and walking with an air of authority, Gerald Hawkins was the kind of man who never had to worry about his next meal. His suit was perfectly pressed, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Even from a distance, Calvin could tell that this was someone important. The man held a phone to his ear, his voice tense, his brows furrowed in frustration. "No, you don't understand. Those stocks need to be sold today. I don't care about the losses, I care about stopping the bleeding." Gerald's voice was clipped, the voice of someone who had spent years making decisions that affected millions. But as Calvin observed him, something else caught his attention. The man's shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, not just with frustration, but something deeper. Worry. Pain. It was a look Calvin had seen before, mostly in the eyes of the other homeless kids who had lost something they couldn't get back. For a brief moment, Calvin allowed himself to wonder, what would it be like to have a life like that? A warm bed, a full plate of food, a father who called to check in. He quickly shook the thought away. Dreams like that were dangerous. They led to disappointment. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of screeching tires. Calvin's eyes darted toward the intersection just in time to see Gerald stepping off the curb, completely unaware of the speeding car barreling toward him. The driver laid on the horn, but Gerald, still caught up in his phone call, didn't react fast enough. For a split second, Calvin hesitated. If I help him, they'll blame me. They always blame the street kids. The thought was instinctual, born from years of experience. But then, something deep inside rebelled against that logic. The same instinct that had helped him survive all these years now pushed him forward. I can't let him die. Without another thought, Calvin sprinted forward. His bare feet barely made a sound against the pavement as he pushed through the crowd. He reached Gerald just in time, throwing all his weight into the man's side. The impact was brutal. Gerald stumbled backward, the force of Calvin's shove sending him sprawling onto the sidewalk. But Calvin wasn't as lucky. The car's bumper clipped his leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. pain exploded through his body as he skidded across the asphalt. A sickening crunch echoed in his ears, and then the world tilted sideways. Somewhere nearby, a woman screamed. A man shouted for someone to call 911. Calvin groaned, blinking up at the swirling sky. His whole body ached, but the relief that Gerald was safe kept him conscious. A shadow loomed over him. It was Gerald, his face pale with shock. "Kid? Kid, can you hear me?" Calvin forced a smile despite the pain. "Yeah, I think so." "Jesus," Gerald muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. His expensive suit was scuffed, his phone discarded on the pavement. You saved my life." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings. People were gathering, murmuring in hushed tones. Gerald knelt beside Calvin, his hands trembling. "Stay awake, kid. Help is coming." "What's your name?" "Calvin," he whispered, the effort of speaking making his head spin. "All right, Calvin, just hold on. You're going to be okay," Gerald reassured him, but his voice wavered. Calvin let out a weak chuckle. "That's my line." And then, as the ambulance doors swung open, the darkness finally pulled him under. Gerald Hawkins sat beside the hospital bed, his normally sharp eyes clouded with concern. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the sterile white room, punctuated by the occasional murmur of nurses in the hallway. The boy, the one who had saved his life, lay unconscious, a deep bruise forming along his temple, his left arm wrapped in a temporary cast. Calvin Morse. That was the name the paramedics had recorded when they rushed him into the ER. A street kid. No known family. No home address. Gerald exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. The pain in his ribs from the accident was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. He had spent his life making decisions that impacted thousands of employees, yet here he was, uncertain about what to do for a single boy. The sound of shifting sheets made him look up. Calvin's eyelids fluttered, then his bright blue eyes, too old for his young face, slowly opened. He blinked a few times, disoriented, before his gaze landed on Gerald. "You're still here?" Calvin's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Gerald let out a small chuckle. "Yeah, kid. I don't make a habit of walking away from people who saved my life." Calvin tried to push himself up but winced, biting back a groan of pain. "Easy," Gerald warned. "You took quite a hit back there." Calvin hesitated, as if unsure how to respond to such genuine concern. Then, his street-hardened instincts kicked in. "Well, you're welcome," he said with a smirk. "Though I gotta say, next time, watch where you're going." Gerald chuckled again, but there was an underlying seriousness in his tone when he said, "I owe you, Calvin. Name your price." Calvin's expression faltered. For a moment, he looked vulnerable, like a boy who had spent too long being ignored. He glanced away, fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of his hospital gown. "I don't want money," he muttered. Gerald frowned. "Then what do you want?" Calvin took a deep breath, then finally met Gerald's gaze. "Just for one day," he said slowly, "pretend to be my dad. That's it. Just one day." The request was so unexpected that Gerald could only stare. Of all the things Calvin could have asked for, cash, a meal, a hotel room for the night, he had asked for something far more valuable. Family. Before Gerald could respond, the door swung open, and a woman in a crisp navy blue suit entered. Her presence alone made the room feel colder. "Mr. Hawkins?" she asked, her tone professional but firm. "I'm Diane Foster." I'm a social worker assigned to Calvin's case. Calvin visibly tensed, his hands clenching the hospital blanket. Gerald immediately noticed and straightened in his chair. Why does he need a social worker? He asked, already suspicious. Diane sighed. Calvin is an unaccompanied minor. No known relatives. No legal guardian. That means he'll need to be placed in temporary care once he's released from the hospital. Calvin's jaw tightened. Which means a group home, he muttered. Or worse. Gerald glanced at him. Worse? Calvin shrugged, avoiding his gaze. You wouldn't understand. Something inside Gerald twisted. He wasn't an emotional man. His whole life had been about numbers, success, and strategy. But seeing the quiet resignation in Calvin's expression made him feel something unfamiliar. Protectiveness. With all due respect, Miss Foster, Gerald said, his voice measured but firm, the kid just saved my life. I'd like to help him. Diane arched a skeptical eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? I'll take him, Gerald said before he even realized what he was saying. Both Calvin and Diane froze. You mean, adopt him? Diane asked incredulously. Gerald hesitated for half a second. Yes, he said, more sure of himself this time. I can provide for him, give him a stable home. Calvin looked at Gerald as if he had grown a second head. Are you serious? Gerald nodded. Completely. Diane exhaled, clearly accustomed to well-meaning people underestimating what taking in a child really meant. Mr. Hawkins, it's not that simple. There's a legal process, background checks, home evaluations. Then let's start the process, Gerald interrupted. Calvin turned away, staring at the hospital ceiling. It won't work, he murmured. Gerald frowned. Why not? Calvin chewed his lip, then finally admitted, people don't keep street kids, Mr. Hawkins. They get rid of us when we're too much trouble. Gerald leaned forward. Then maybe it's time someone proved that wrong. For the first time in a long while, Calvin had no response. Diane still looked skeptical. You should sleep on it, Mr. Hawkins. This isn't a decision to make lightly. I don't make decisions lightly, Gerald said, his voice unwavering. And I've already made this one. Diane sighed, nodding. Very well. I'll begin the paperwork. But understand, this is temporary until we can determine a long-term plan. Gerald nodded. That's all I ask. Diane left the room, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Calvin sat up slightly, wincing from the pain. So, you're really gonna pretend to be my dad for a day? He asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Gerald smirked. Looks like I'm signing up for more than just a day, kid. Calvin blinked at him, his expression unreadable. And then, slowly, the smallest hint of a smile crossed his face. For the first time in years, Calvin Morse had hope. The morning sun streamed through the wide hospital windows, casting soft golden light onto the stark white walls. Calvin Morse sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his injured leg now wrapped in a proper cast. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the rough texture of the fabric, but his mind was elsewhere. Gerald Hawkins stood near the doorway, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket. He looked out of place in the hospital room, too polished, too powerful for the worn linoleum floors and beeping machines. And yet, he was here. Calvin still couldn't quite believe it. You ready to go, kid? Gerald asked, his voice even, almost casual. But there was something in his tone, something careful, as if he wasn't quite sure how to handle this situation. Calvin hesitated, his fingers tightening on the hospital sheets. "Where exactly are we going?" Gerald smirked. "Didn't you ask for a dad for a day?" Calvin blinked at him. He hadn't really expected Gerald to follow through, and certainly not this soon. Most adults forgot their promises. Most adults never even meant them in the first place. "So, you're serious about this?" Calvin asked cautiously, his blue eyes scanning Gerald's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Gerald nodded. "You saved my life, Calvin. The least I can do is give you a good day. A real one. Whatever you want to do, we'll do it." Calvin swallowed hard. He didn't know how to process that. It wasn't about money. He had no interest in fancy cars or expensive food. What he wanted was something much harder to ask for. "I just want to know what it feels like," Calvin admitted quietly. "To have someone look out for me. Even if it's just for today." Gerald's smirk faded, replaced by something softer. "All right, kid. Let's get out of here." The first stop was breakfast. Calvin had spent years grabbing food wherever he could, leftovers from dumpsters, scraps given by kind strangers, or cheap gas station snacks. But now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he sat in a real diner. It wasn't one of those fancy, high-end places Gerald probably frequented. This was a classic American diner, the kind with red leather booths, black and white checkered floors, and the smell of sizzling bacon in the air. A waitress, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, poured them both fresh coffee. She gave Calvin a wink. "You look like a pancakes kind of kid." Calvin, still not used to being treated like a normal person, hesitated. He glanced at Gerald. Gerald set down his menu. "Order whatever you want, kid." That was all the encouragement Calvin needed. "Pancakes," he said quickly. "And bacon. And eggs. Scrambled." The waitress grinned. "Good choice, hon." Gerald ordered his own breakfast, black coffee and eggs over easy, before turning his attention back to Calvin. "So, what's next? Baseball game? Arcade?" Calvin took a bite of his pancake, savoring the warmth and sweetness. He thought about it carefully. "I want to do normal stuff," he said finally. "Like what dads and kids do." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Calvin poked at his bacon. "I dunno. Just stuff." Gerald nodded slowly, considering. "All right. How about this? After breakfast, we go to the park. Maybe feed the ducks, toss a football around. Then we'll see a movie, your pick. Sound good?" Calvin stared at him. "You really don't have to do all this, you know." Gerald took a sip of his coffee. "I know." A small, uncertain smile tugged at the corners of Calvin's mouth. For once in his life, someone was keeping their word. The day unfolded like a dream. At the park, they found an old football in Gerald's car. Gerald wasn't exactly an athlete, but he threw a decent spiral, and Calvin, despite his injured leg, managed to catch most of them. They sat on a bench, watching families stroll by, kids laughing and playing. Calvin noticed how other dads would ruffle their sons' hair or clap them on the back after a good throw. It was the kind of thing he had always watched from a distance. Gerald must have noticed too because, after one particularly good catch, he reached out and gave Calvin's shoulder a firm pat. "Nice hands, kid." Calvin didn't know why, but that simple gesture meant everything. Later, they went to the movies. Calvin picked an animated one, something lighthearted, though he'd never admit he actually enjoyed it. They sat in the dark theater, munching on popcorn. At one point, Gerald absent-mindedly passed Calvin a napkin when he got butter on his fingers. It was such a small thing, but it hit Calvin like a ton of bricks. This is what it's like, he realized. To be looked after. As the sun began to set, they stopped at an ice cream shop. Calvin sat across from Gerald, a chocolate cone in his hand, licking the melting ice cream before it could drip. "I don't want today to end," he admitted quietly. Gerald set down his spoon, watching Calvin carefully. "It doesn't have to." Calvin looked up. "What do you mean?" Gerald exhaled. "I mean, I don't want this to be just one day. I want to help you. Not just now, but for real." Calvin froze. His heart pounded so hard he was sure Gerald could hear it. "You're just saying that," he mumbled. Gerald leaned forward. "No, I'm not. I started today thinking I was doing you a favor. But the truth is, you've done something for me, too." Calvin frowned. "Like what?" Gerald hesitated. Then, with rare honesty, he said, "You reminded me what it means to care about someone. To put someone else first. I don't want to lose that." Calvin swallowed hard. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. "Are you saying, you want to keep me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gerald nodded. "If you'll have me." Calvin looked away, blinking fast, trying to hide the burning in his eyes. He had spent his whole life alone, convinced no one would ever fight for him. But now, sitting in a tiny ice cream shop with melted chocolate on his fingers, he realized something astonishing. For the first time ever, he had a home. The warmth of the previous day still lingered in Calvin's heart as he woke up in a soft bed, a real bed, not a cold alley or a worn-out cardboard box. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of Gerald Hawkins' mansion, casting a golden glow over the elegantly furnished guest room. For the first time in years, Calvin woke up feeling safe. But safety, he knew, was a fragile thing. The sharp knock on the door made his stomach drop. He barely had time to sit up before Gerald's voice called from outside. "Calvin, we need to talk." Calvin swung his legs over the bed, wincing as his injured ankle throbbed. The door creaked open, and Gerald stepped inside, his face serious. He was dressed in his usual crisp suit, but there was an exhaustion in his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "What's wrong?" Calvin asked, already bracing himself for bad news. Gerald sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The social worker is on her way." Calvin's stomach twisted. "They're taking me, aren't they?" he muttered, gripping the blanket tightly. Gerald didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from Calvin, his expression unreadable. "They want to place you in foster care," he admitted. "Diane, the social worker, thinks that's the best option." Calvin forced himself to keep his face blank. He had learned long ago that showing fear never helped. "But that's not happening," Gerald continued, his voice firm. "I'm fighting for you, kid. I've already contacted a lawyer." Calvin's heart jumped. You mean it?" Gerald nodded. "I meant what I said yesterday. This isn't just for a day. I want you to stay." A lump formed in Calvin's throat, but before he could say anything, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made them both turn. The battle was about to begin. Diane Foster, the social worker, entered the mansion with the air of someone who had done this 100 times before. She carried a thick folder under her arm, her expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. Hawkins," she greeted with a nod before turning to Calvin. "Calvin." How are you feeling today? Calvin shifted uncomfortably. Fine. Diane sat down at the dining table, opening her folder. I understand that you've been through a lot these past few days, she began, her voice calm and measured. But we need to talk about what happens next. Gerald crossed his arms. What happens next is that Calvin stays here. Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Hawkins, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is not a simple situation. Calvin is a minor without legal guardianship. That means the state has to step in and find him a proper placement. Gerald leaned forward. And why can't that placement be here? Diane sighed. Because legal guardianship isn't something you can just declare overnight. There's a process, home evaluations, background checks, court hearings. And even then, we prioritize placements with foster families who are already in the system. Calvin's chest tightened. He had heard those words before. He knew what they meant. Foster families didn't keep kids like him. They'll just send me somewhere else, Calvin mumbled, staring at the table. Somewhere I don't belong. Diane softened slightly. Not all foster families are bad, Calvin. Calvin clenched his fists. Then why do kids keep running away from them? A heavy silence fell over the room. Gerald took a deep breath, his tone measured but unwavering. Listen, I understand the rules, but let's be realistic here. Calvin doesn't need another temporary home. He needs stability. He needs to know that someone is going to be there tomorrow and the day after that. And I want to be that person. Diane studied Gerald carefully. You'd have to go through the full adoption process, she warned. That's not a small commitment. I know, Gerald said simply. And you're sure about this? Gerald glanced at Calvin, who was staring at him with wide, hopeful eyes. I've never been more sure about anything in my life. Despite Gerald's determination, the system was slow, and Diane wasn't backing down easily. Until the legal process is started, Calvin has to come with me, she insisted. Calvin felt cold all over. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it worse. No, he said quietly. Diane sighed. Calvin. No. Calvin stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. I don't want to go. I don't care about background checks or whatever rules you have. Mr. Hawkins wants me. Nobody has ever wanted me before. His voice cracked, and he hated it, but he couldn't stop. I don't want to go back to being nobody. Diane looked at him with genuine sympathy. It's not about wanting, Calvin. It's about the law. Calvin turned to Gerald, panic rising in his chest. You promised, he whispered. Gerald's jaw tightened. And I don't break promises. He turned back to Diane. Give me 24 hours. Diane hesitated. Mr. Hawkins. 24 hours, he repeated. I'll have my lawyer start the process today. Just let Calvin stay here until then. Diane studied him for a long moment before exhaling. Fine. 24 hours. She snapped her folder shut. But if you don't have legal paperwork by then, I have no choice but to take him. She turned to Calvin. I know this is hard, Calvin. But I need you to understand, this isn't about punishing you. We just need to do what's best for you. Calvin shook his head. What's best for me is staying with him. Diane sighed but didn't argue. I'll be back tomorrow. With that, she left, leaving the room in tense silence. Calvin felt drained, like all the hope had been sucked out of him. 24 hours isn't enough, he murmured. Gerald placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll make it enough." Calvin looked up at him, searching his face for any doubt. He found none. For the first time in his life, someone was fighting for him. And that meant everything. Gerald Hawkins had closed million-dollar deals in boardrooms filled with the sharpest minds in the country. He had negotiated contracts that determined the fate of entire corporations. But nothing had ever felt as urgent, as deeply personal, as the battle he was fighting now. Seated in his home office, he tightened his grip on the phone. His lawyer, Richard Calloway, a longtime friend and one of the best in family law, was speaking in a steady, measured tone. "Gerald, I'll be honest with you," Richard said. "It's going to be tough. Adopting a child, especially on short notice, isn't something the courts take lightly. The system is designed to protect kids, but it also makes everything slow and bureaucratic." Gerald exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for slow, Richard. Diane Foster is coming back tomorrow. If I don't have something legal in place, they're going to take him away." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Then we have one option," Richard said. "Emergency guardianship. It's temporary, but it would allow you to keep Calvin in your care while we work on the formal adoption." Gerald straightened. "How fast can we file?" "I can draft the petition today, but we need a judge to sign off on it." Richard hesitated. "And you'll need to prove to the court that this is in Calvin's best interest. That means evidence. Testimonies." Gerald glanced toward the hallway, where Calvin sat on the living room couch, staring at the fireplace with a quiet intensity. "I'll get whatever we need," Gerald said. "Just tell me where to start." By mid-afternoon, Gerald had pulled every string he could. He called former employees who could vouch for his character, contacted a private investigator to dig into Calvin's history in the foster system, and arranged a meeting with a judge he knew through charity work. When the time came to leave, he turned to Calvin. "Come on, kid. We're going to court." Calvin's eyes widened. "Court? Like, with a judge?" "Yep." Gerald grabbed his coat. "We're gonna prove you belong here." Calvin hesitated, his fingers gripping the fabric of his hoodie. "And if they say no?" Gerald crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. "Then we keep fighting." Calvin swallowed hard, then nodded. "Okay." The courthouse was an imposing stone building, its halls lined with people waiting for their hearings. Gerald led Calvin through the corridors, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. Inside the small courtroom, a judge in his 60s sat behind the bench, his expression unreadable. Gerald recognized him, Judge Whitaker, a fair man but one who didn't tolerate nonsense. Richard stepped forward, placing a folder of documents on the judge's desk. "Your Honor, we are requesting an emergency guardianship order for Calvin Morse under the care of Mr. Hawkins." Judge Whitaker flipped through the papers. "Mr. Calloway, I see that your client is a successful businessman, but this is highly irregular. What evidence do you have that this is in the child's best interest?" Richard nodded toward Gerald. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like Mr. Hawkins to speak for himself." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Very well." Gerald stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, I know I don't look like the typical candidate for a foster parent. I've spent most of my life in boardrooms, not playgrounds. But that doesn't mean I can't be a father." He glanced at Calvin, who was sitting stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped in his lap. "This boy saved my life, not just physically but in ways I didn't even realize I needed." The judge studied him carefully. "Mr. Hawkins, do you understand the commitment you're making? This isn't just about offering shelter, it's about being responsible for another life." I understand that, Your Honor, Gerald said firmly. And I want to be responsible for him. Calvin doesn't need another temporary home. He needs someone who isn't going to leave when things get tough. Calvin looked up at Gerald with wide eyes, as if hearing those words made something inside him shift. Judge Whitaker exhaled through his nose, then turned his gaze toward Calvin. Son, what do you think about all this? Calvin hesitated, his fingers tightening on his pant leg. I don't want to go back to foster care, he admitted quietly. I know Mr. Hawkins doesn't have to do this. But I want to stay. He keeps his promises. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, deep in thought. The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he nodded. I'll approve the emergency guardianship order. Relief washed over Gerald so fast he almost had to sit down. Calvin blinked, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. But, Judge Whitaker added, this is temporary. If you want full custody, you'll need to go through the proper adoption process. Gerald nodded. Understood. Judge Whitaker signed the papers, stamping them with an official seal. Then it's settled. Calvin Morse, you are officially under the guardianship of Gerald Hawkins. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp evening air, Calvin looked up at Gerald. So, I can stay, he asked, as if afraid to believe it. Gerald smiled. Yeah, kid. You're staying. Calvin let out a slow breath, then, before Gerald could react, threw his arms around him. For a moment, Gerald froze. He wasn't used to this kind of affection, but then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him tight. Thank you, Calvin mumbled. Gerald ruffled his hair. I told you, I don't break promises. As they walked back to the car, Calvin finally allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Life has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. Gerald Hawkins, a man once consumed by wealth and success, never imagined that a young street boy would not only save his life but change it forever. Likewise, Calvin Morse, a child accustomed to being discarded, never expected someone to truly fight for him. Their journey together reminds us of a fundamental truth: family is not just about blood, but about love, commitment, and the willingness to stand by someone when the world tells you to walk away. For those of us who have lived long enough to see life's ups and downs, this story carries a powerful message: it's never too late to change, to care, or to open your heart to someone in need. Sometimes, a second chance doesn't just change another person's life, it transforms our own. Gerald thought he was rescuing Calvin, but in reality, they saved each other. This is a lesson we can all take to heart. No matter our age, we still have the power to make a difference, to be a source of hope, guidance, and love. Whether through mentoring, supporting a struggling loved one, or simply showing kindness to someone who needs it, we can become a light in someone's darkness. Because in the end, the greatest legacy we leave is not in wealth or achievements, but in the lives we touch and the love we give.